If you ever have a chance to move away to another country, always take it because you can always go back. Did you see the interview that Mark Zuckerberg did with Lex Friedman inside the Metaverse? Yeah. So one of the things that I thought was really good about that was they were accurately represented as themselves. What does a post-nation state, post-democratic, post-capitalistic, post-fiat world look like?
Mindblowers, uncovering the mysteries of the future. This episode, the Metaverse, Future of Education and Modular Passports, with Michael Rosmer and your host, Daniel Kafer.
I was thinking about one of the main reasons that some of my friends give me for not kind of migrating would be family. They would say, yeah, but we don't want to move the kids. We have great education in Denmark. And I always tell them, no, we don't have great education. We have free education in Denmark, and there's a huge difference between great and free. But I think kids are probably like one of the kind of mental blockers. I think another mental blocker for some people would be family, maybe aging parents, for example. Have you seen people kind of take the leap of faith anyway, and then because of like aging parents or children kind of return to their home country?
It sometimes happens. I was given this piece of advice years ago. Somebody told me, they said, listen, if you ever have a chance to move away to another country, always take it because you can always go back. And I think this is, people kind of view that as like this permanent decision sometimes, and that becomes a mental blocker that really doesn't need to be there. You can come back. It's not that big a deal. I do think that like parents as they age, and in particular as they become unwell, clearly becomes a bigger thing. And the truth is that that's not even about, hey, it didn't work now. It might just be they've just gotten worse. And so I want to be there more in some way. I had this thing, somebody told me a couple of summers ago, they said, you're probably only going to see your dad 20 more times. And I was like, what are you talking about? They said, well, yeah, he's 70, statistically dead by 90. You see him once a year, that's 20 years or 20 times. And so I've made quite a bit of a bigger attempt since then to try and spend more time with my parents, because I'm like, holy man, that's a big deal. And so I suspect that probably a lot of people go through that as their parents reach a certain stage. But at the same time, I talked to a good friend of mine, and his girlfriend is really close to her family. And one of the reasons that he won't move, he would move happily himself, but she doesn't want to move. And the reason she doesn't want to move is because of seeing her parents. But the truth is she doesn't see her parents that often anyway. And so it's sort of this weird mental block where he'll tell her, he's like, listen, we can come back a couple times a year for a couple months, and you can spend the full time with them, not just like, hey, I saw you on a weekend once every couple months. It's like, no, you can have a concerted, in-person, wonderful time in high value with them. And you'll probably get more out of that and more of it than you're getting today while still living a fair distance away. So I don't know. It's interesting to observe different people's exploration of that. And again, obviously it's super, super personal. But I would say the majority that I see, once they kind of get out of where they've been, they tend not to go back. And what I mean by this is when you first start living abroad, my experience anyway, is that there's sort of things you miss about home. And you kind of feel like, oh, I want to go back for this and this and this. But then you go back and you're like, well, wasn't that good? Maybe I remembered it as being a bit better than it was. And at the same time, I start to become acclimatized to this new place. That new place is the thing that I kind of relate to. After a while, you're like, yeah, I don't really need to go back that much anymore. There's a really great line from one of my favorite authors, Antoine Saint-Exupéry, wrote a book called Southern Mail. And it's telling the story of, he was a pilot in the 20s, back when flying was a brand new thing, right? And he was flying the mails. And he said he went away and he left his small hometown and he experienced all these things in pilot training. And he wanted so badly that when he would go back to his hometown, things would not have changed. And he wanted to share all these things that he experienced. And he goes back to his hometown and he said he's so disappointed that things have not changed because he has changed. And he tries to tell people about all these amazing things. And they kind of they can't connect to it the way that he has because they didn't experience it. And suddenly, he has this new home, and that new home is a part of him. in a way that you know, it just wasn't in the past. And as a result, he kind of has to move on. And so there's like kind of this critical skill of learning to build community and build a new home and build a new life somewhere different. And if you can do that, then I think, yeah, the reason to go back is very small, aside from visits.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also think that like as technology advances, the barriers will come down even further. I mean, I'm thinking if at some point we could go into, I would call it a dream state, sort of a lucid dreaming state where we could visit parents that way, maybe even in a virtual location, who knows. I think more and more people might feel comfortable with online schools.
What are your kind of thoughts on the timeline of where we're at with respect to broad adoption or comfort and familiarity with kind of VR-like technologies?
So I think VR has been a bit like nuclear fusion, right? We've been talking about it for 15 years, and it's still not that good, right? So I did dive into it, and most experts say that about in 4 years' time, computer power should be good enough for it to be a worthwhile experience. And the reason I'm saying that kind of sounds reasonable is because I used to work at Meta, and when we tried out the headsets in the beginning, I was like, I'm sorry to spoil the party, but this is really bad. I get nauseous. There's no fun. I can't wait to take it off, right? And now I think it's at the stage where it's okay. And I think in 4 years, you'll be like, hey, this is super cool.
Do you think that there seems to be sort of a weird barrier? I mean, okay, so you've got the Meta devices right now. Apple released the Vision Pro. Okay, obviously the Vision Pro is super expensive for a lot of people, so that doesn't really work out that well. But on the other hand, there did seem to be people feeling like, wow, this is like kind of a wow moment. And yet, in spite of that, I don't see people having really immersed in it, and in particular stuck with it. It's not like I don't know anyone who's kind of like addicted to their Vision Pro or their Meta goggle hero whatever device. It's kind of like it's a gimmick. It's a fun thing. It's a bit like it's not that different from, I don't know, like Apple Watches or iPads or something. Everybody went and bought an iPad, but come back and people are like, oh yeah, it doesn't really quite do what my computer does, and it's not as convenient as my phone, so it mostly sits and collects dust. So what do you think it takes to kind of get people broadly on board with using these things full time or not, regularly to a large extent?
I think maybe different experiences. I think we're trying to convert some of the experience we already enjoy as they are. Like, for example, I play FIFA on my PS5, and I enjoy that. And I don't have a need to go into kind of VR to do that. And it would be super, I think, unpractical to like do running motions and stuff like that. But I think if it could put me more in a really immersive state, for example, I would say when picking a country to live, maybe it could really put you inside the city. Like, for example, my wife said it could be super cool to live 1 or 2 years in the States, simply to make sure that the kids would be native speakers instead of, well, semi-fluent. And I was like, okay, let's have a look at YouTube, what that feels like. And we're looking at videos, and it still really doesn't give you the feel, right? I'm thinking something like that, if you could really go into an immersed state exploring.
Like the idea of being virtual. One of the things that did you see the interview that Mark Zuckerberg did with Lex Friedman inside the Metaverse? Yeah. So like one of the things that I thought was really good about that was they were accurately represented as themselves. That kind of thing strikes me as being, because I think about, okay, the idea of being with relatives at a distance in VR seems attractive. Right? Okay, I don't have to go there, but I can still be with you. We can have this in-person interaction. It feels really normal, etc. What do you need for that? Well, to start off with, I need you to be like you, not some sort of a weird cartoon avatar or something. I'm not going to feel like I'm actually with you if that's the case. Then it seems like there's just such huge learning hacks that could be had because you can take things apart, you can play with them, you can, You imagine like taking apart a car engine or something like that, right? And try doing that in anything other than VR, and it's just not going to be that real of an experience. So it seems like education has got to be this massive unlock, but I don't know what the gap is there in terms of software and kind of getting these other things together. So it'll be interesting to see whether it really catches on without. I think like if you have a like Neuralink device that's super immersive, then of course at that point in time I think it makes sense. But other because you won't have the tactile sense very well at all. You won't have olfactory. You won't have taste. You won't. Basically, it's only visual, right? Visual and audio. You know, you can reproduce all those other senses if you have some sort of a Neuralink device. But being able to do so with VR, I don't know. It's kind of weird to have something stuck up your nose that it's blowing on you, or something like that. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Excited for the possibilities, but I'm not so sure. It's just not as obvious as like an iPhone, right? It doesn't have that obvious appeal in the same way.
I definitely agree. But I think still, when you look at technology, I think we can agree that it's part of accelerating this great migration, correct? And I was just thinking, so what do you think the response is going to be? I mean, in terms of, for example, taxes, or some of these countries like the Scandinavian countries, Germany, Canada, where people are starting to leave, do you think they will start to be a little bit imprisoned, like some sort of government tax or exit tax that you can't really get around?
So I think like one of the things to think about is what time horizon are you talking about, right? So some of the things that I'm super fascinated by are like, okay, what does a post-nation state, post-democratic, post-capitalistic, post-fiat world look like, right? What I would call new societal OS. Because I do think that the coordination functions that exist within society need to change pretty dramatically to facilitate a lot of what's going on. I have this, I kind of posed this question a number of years ago where I was like, okay, like what is the greatest problems in society? To me, if you kind of like boil down to root causes, I think some of the greatest challenges facing modern society are the explosion of complexity and scale. And this is just functionally because of the fact that your biology is not equipped for it, right? You were evolved in a very simple, like low complexity, low scale environment. That was the reality. And so you're just not prepared to handle it. Our sociological structures are not prepared to handle it. And so out of this results all sorts of negative externalities. You think about something really simple like, criminal systems, right? Okay, well, when the criminal is in Africa doing something online, you have no ability to enforce the laws. So then what happens? Well, that's an issue. If you think about decision making, there's this kind of principle within capitalism that the free market will sort of decide what the best products are, and that will have this bubble up effect, which is going to be meritocratic, et cetera. But the more you increase the complexity of products, and the more you increase the downstream effects of using those products, let's just kind of think, for example, about sugars, right? But you could have all sorts of medicines that you don't see the consequences for 20 years. Well, the market doesn't make good decisions in those cases because the individual actors can't possibly have the information to make those good decisions. So hence you have all these externalities. So I think like we will have a redevelopment of coordination methods.
So I'm just thinking about, what do you think the established nations where people are actually leaving, what are they going to do in terms of taxes? Also, I'm thinking because many of the people who actually leave are the quite affluent, people with high education, maybe high net worth individuals. So I guess it's not sustainable for Scandinavia, for Canada, that people continue to leave to low tax countries.
There's sort of, I think, different time frames a person has to consider. There's like a famous quote from Gandhi or something about like, first they ignore you, then they do this, then they do that, and eventually you win, sort of thing. So I think there's probably a similar sort of deal where at first they ignore you, right? What happens? It's like, oh, great, you want to leave? Well, and there's almost this ego associated with it, right? We're so great, so why would you want to leave? That's just a ridiculous concept. Oh, if you're going to leave, go ahead. I see this. I did a video on kind of the idea of getting out of Australia because of how crazy things were getting there. And, you see in the comments tons and tons of Australians who are like, good, if you're not going to contribute, get out. We don't need you anyway, this sort of thing. And so you've got like that effect, which is, I think, the initial response, right? Then I think the second response that you can say is yeah, you start to get restrictive. And I think the obvious restrictions are, first of all, yeah, exit tax. Okay. I mean, there's actually kind of some justice in exit tax. It's kind of a pain for you if you're leaving. But the truth is, okay, that's pretty broadly distributed across a lot of countries already. So exit tax is not an insane idea. The third thing is more like what they have in Norway. They also have something like this in Mexico, in Spain, and a few different places, which is, all right, when you leave, you're not immediately out of our tax system. In the case of Norway, it's a 4-year rule. It, again, varies a little bit by the country, but usually they'll say, you're going to remain a tax resident of our country for X number of years after you've left. And there's different ways that they do that, right? If you're in Ireland, then they have this concept of ordinarily resident versus domiciled. And so you have this 3-year rule around ordinarily resident. In a lot of these cases, it's fine so long as you move to a tax treaty country, or it might be fine so long as you don't move to a tax haven country. And so, they build up some things like that where they, like, you think within the EU, right? They're not going to be able to sit there and say, well, you can't move to another EU country. That like deliberately violates the whole principle of freedom of movement within the EU. So hence a lot of people, this happens, right? If you look at the flood of people, essentially, for anyone who's watching and didn't know, Norway increased their wealth tax just recently. They saw a flood of like the centimillionaires and billionaires all leaving the country sort of thing. Where did those guys go? Well, they didn't go to Dubai. They went to Switzerland for the most part. Why'd they go to Switzerland? Well, because Switzerland's a tax treaty country. It's sort of palatable, but it still is better than what's going on. I think that's probably bullish for countries like Switzerland over time. You're probably going to get a lot more wealthy people going to Switzerland, and Switzerland's probably going to do fairly well as a country in the next period. Some people are kind of deeply concerned that you'll get U.S. citizenship-based taxation thing. I tend to mostly not think that's going to happen. I think it's more likely this thing that I'm mentioning. And the reason for that is just because of the fact that it would require renegotiating all sorts of treaties. So it's actually quite complicated. It's not just so easy as saying, hey, we're going to tax based on citizenship. It's like, well, you have all these tax treaties and things that are causing issues for you. So the easier thing to do is just to say, okay, if you're moving to a non-tax treaty country or you're moving to a tax haven, we'll define some list of tax havens. Then for X number of years, you're still taxable here. And that's a disincentive for you to leave. Now, I think the question about kind of, are these people, like how much does the loss of these people economically hurt the country, is sort of an interesting one. And I think it's based, like, people's ideas are, okay, you have like the Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged sort of thing going on, which is a little bit of an idea. But there's another side that I think is a little bit fallacious. And this is based on thinking of money as a thing. And I think this is like a super common error that people have. People think of money as wealth, but money is not wealth. Real goods and services are wealth. And so, okay, you have less people paying taxes, but do you have less production of real goods and services? That's like the real question. And I don't see that nations think very well about this. I don't find that individuals think very well about this. But theoretically speaking, if you think about a country like Norway, for example, right? Norway has a lot of pretty good internal production systems. They have a big, powerful sovereign wealth fund. They've got essentially state-owned companies. What are they really losing when they have these people fleeing the country? Like, on monetarily, it looks like, okay, hey, we're not collecting as much in tax. But does that actually matter? Is that really the important metric, or is the important metric real goods and services? And have the real goods and services changed? So I think the biggest thing there is, like, do you lose employers? If people are not forming companies in your country and therefore not creating jobs and not driving innovation that can push export, et cetera, that's where I think you run into the biggest issue. But yeah, I suspect that the spectrum is, do ignore it, don't worry about it, then try and like penalize it because it feels a bit unfair. And beyond kind of penalizing it feels unfair, is you will have these new models of society that will start to pop up. And those new models of society are going to have different mechanisms for figuring out, okay, how do we do taxation? How do we kind of collectively pay for things? How do we enforce rules? How do we decide what it is that you have for people coming in? Because the other side also comes into play, right? Which is, what have you seen since COVID? You've seen an explosion of digital nomad visas. There's like dozens of them all over the place. Why? Because all these countries want those people to come and spend the time in their country, so they'll spend money there. They can collect money off sales tax or whatever, create jobs. And guess what? They don't have to provide any services to those people for the most part, right? These digital nomads aren't people you're giving health care or education or whatever to. Yeah, okay, you have roads, etc. But in theory, you can structure your tax system. The UAE has been super smart about this, right? Like UAE draws all these people in. They've got a ton of tourists, but they've also got a ton of people who come and become residents. Those residents don't get really anything from the government, but they still pay VAT. There's a lot of consumption that's encouraged locally. They pay real estate taxes. They're spending money on government-owned businesses, and as a result, the government's generating capital that way, and off they go. Not a terrible way to organize a society. They've been pretty smart in that regard. So I think you'll probably see a lot of innovation and adaptation in how these systems are set up, just as you have to contend with this new reality. And it won't just be about trying to keep people from going. It will also be countries realizing, well, actually, we need to try and attract people. And how do we go about doing that? You see it in Singapore, right? Singapore, kind of in the sort of post-COVID, during COVID, Singapore closed down. It was hard for people to get in. There was, all these restrictions, et cetera. But then on the backside of it, they said, oh, we need to be really competitive on talent. Like, talent is one of the most important things for Singapore. So as a result, what are we doing? We're going to go and we're going to introduce some visas that we can bring in the right types of people. And so I suspect that continues. Something that I'm super interested in the idea of is, again, like you think about these sort of, how do things advance going forward? And I think modularizing a lot of things that have previously been monolithic is an area that could be really cool. So for example, passports. We have this idea of citizenship as this like bundle, right? And that bundle is like, you can vote, you get government services, you get to live here, you have a travel document, you have all this. There's not really a clear inherent reason why we should bundle all of that into one thing. Why wouldn't you modularize those things? I mean, passports being the most obvious, really simple one. Think about it this way. So like, there's a whole industry of people who sell passports and things. I'm in that industry to some extent. And people want the ability to travel. Now, what makes it that you're a good person to travel to my country? What kind of fills that in? You can kind of say, okay, well, probably that you're going to bring money with you. That's probably a good thing. I don't want to have to support you. And I probably don't want you to break the rules. I don't want you to do crime or something. And provided those things are true, then great. Well, how do we currently screen for whether somebody can come into the country? It's whether they're born in a particular place, which doesn't indicate either of those two things. You could literally be born in a country where, they have a powerful passport and you're a broke criminal, and you could get to go visa free to some place. You could cause all kinds of problems there. Whereas by contrast, somebody who is a good law-abiding citizen who is wealthy from a country with a poor passport, and they can't go there. So why wouldn't you create some sort of an interoperability layer that is, kind of says, hey, listen, what are we doing? We're screening you for these things that countries care about. And then we're going to go and we're going to get agreements from those countries that they're going to accept this as this travel document. This seems like a very obvious thing to me, that you need a certain critical mass, you need to go and kind of gradually build it up over time, et cetera. But it seems very much achievable. You have these issues like, well, you're from Denmark. So in Denmark, they have all these huge problems with immigrants not integrating into society. And there's this whole backlash going on. They're saying, okay, we're not going to allow people to be overly concentrated in where they live anymore and all this. It's like, well, one of the concerns people have is people are coming to our country and they're moving here, and then they're going to change our culture. Well, why do we have this weird idea that the ability to vote needs to be coupled with these other things? Why couldn't you say, hey, you're a citizen in the sense that you're allowed to live here, work here, do whatever, get services, but you weren't a native person here, so therefore you're not allowed to vote. It's only second generation beyond or something that can vote, or however it is you want to decide that. Like, why don't we decouple these things? we know this from a computer science standpoint that modular architectures tend to work better. If you were to go and propose to Facebook that we're going to make the entire system monolithic, it would be a disaster. And so why not a bunch of these other parts of society? So I think that's like a very interesting line of reasoning in terms of how things could develop. And so we'll see. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree a lot with that. But I also know there's a lot of resistance so I lived in both Denmark and Sweden. And to even bring up that there are different levels of citizenships and passports, the dinner table would just go quiet. And they would be like, you're one of those people. So, either you would be among people who would be open-minded and say, I feel the same and I'm tired of the crime from immigrants and so on, but you're definitely stepping in something quite dangerous. And I think it's because on the right wing, you have this mix of extremists who are actually really racist that would propose these ideas.
Yep.
And then on the other hand, you would have people with not a single racist bone in their body also proposing it. But you get mixed up with the racist people when you start talking about things like this. At least that is what my experience is from Scandinavia. And I also think there's so many misconceptions in Scandinavia. I always have friends saying, so when are you coming back? And I'm always like, well, there's not really a plan to come back because I don't think it's that great. And I think there's that kind of sense, well, then there must be something slightly wrong with you to kind of have that opinion. So yeah, I think it's interesting. I think things like the school system, things like, passports, I think it will change very, very, very slowly. I think what you're proposing makes sense. Whether it will happen in the next decade, I probably don't think so. Not from the countries I know of.
Yeah, I think that's why I led with the passport one, because I think the passport one is a very easy win. Essentially, you could get, let's say, 50,000 people who are all, millionaires, who all have no criminal record, right? So they're like, hey, listen, these are like good law-abiding people who have money. And that's basically the size of a small country, right? If you're going to get a Cayman Islands or Gibraltar or, something like that, you would find that population 50,000 is kind of like, that's a small country. And you say, okay, great. Then you go and you start going to small countries that want tourists. And you say, hey, listen, we want you, we're going to issue a thing. We will vet these people. We'll ensure a minimum standard of these people. And we want you to give them visa-free access on this document to be allowed to visit your country. They can't live there. They can just stay for 30 days, whatever the normal thing is. And I think it's a pretty easy win because a lot of these places want tourists. And these happen to be a high grade of tourist. And then I think you can kind of like get that going with some momentum where, okay, now you're kind of issuing like a private passport. The idea that a company would issue a passport is not a terrible idea in itself, right? Why shouldn't Facebook issue passports to their employees and have that recognized? And it's not like an insane negotiating thing because you're not saying, hey, listen, these people have to be able to vote. You're not saying, all you're saying is, hey, listen, they're just pre-authorized to come into our country. And you're easing some of the transit. Okay, there's some technology integration because you have to integrate into the passport system at customs, et cetera. Not that heavy a lift. There's literally new countries that pop up every now and then. So, it's not totally nuts in that regard. And I think that's like, to me, probably like the easiest starting point. If you had the will, you could probably organize a group of people to do that. And you could probably get, a few countries to rate. You can see this a little bit with like Liberland. Liberland, for anyone who's not familiar, is this sort of, they would call themselves the first libertarian country. It's this small little piece of land between Serbia and Croatia that basically, due to border disputes, it kind of got left out and they claimed it. And so, they're out there going and advocating a particular idea. I think the Liberland passport is now recognized in Colombia, if I recall correctly. There's like one place that recognizes it. And, they go and they do some efforts here. Liberland is not that compelling of an entity to go and accept for a group, and they're not coming and they're not saying, "Hey, listen, we're screening people for this standard." And I think if you got enough momentum, then you would start to, you get, I don't know, the first 30 countries or something, and now it's a recognized thing, right? Now they're like, "Oh, okay, great," and then it gives an opportunity for others, whether it's a big company or whether it's some private membership group, to be able to go and do the same thing. So that's kind of like what I see as the entry point, and then I see the other things as being, yeah, it takes decades, and some of these things will probably never change within the structure of nations as they are today. Like, you will have to have something like a pop-up city that evolves into, you've got Prospera in Honduras or things like this. People doing these experiments, and they get to say, okay, well, we get to rethink things, and so we're going to do it a little bit differently, and then hopefully that becomes successful enough and inspires some other ideas that it can feed on to the next level and the next level.
But I think one thing that could drive this in terms of the Great Migration would be if more politicians actually try to live in different countries. So I think like living in Qatar was a really good example, right? So I'm not by any means saying that Qatar is perfect. But from a personal freedom point of view, I think it's very misunderstood, because I felt like my personal freedom was very high there, right? Because I would choose my doctor. I would get like immediate service from my doctors. Anything was wrong, right? We could get knee surgery within 24 hours. My wife got that. We could choose the school we wanted. So all the everyday stuff, we had like 100% personal freedom. And then you could say, well, could you wear the clothes you wanted? Yeah, I don't think we ever really needed to adapt. Then you have the compound situation where you can pretty much do whatever you want, drink alcohol and so on. But I think people don't get that, and a lot of people are saying, but how can you function in a place that doesn't have democracy? And from a practical point of view, it's not that difficult.
Yes. Yeah, this is a big thing I get with people who have never been to UAE before. I'll have lots of clients who will call up and they'll talk to me, and sometimes they'll say, "Oh, I would like to move to Dubai, but my wife would never be okay with it." I'm like, "Oh, interesting. Like, what's the reason?" They're like, "Oh, it's this Islam thing that blah blah blah." And I'm like, "Okay, well, like, look, it's totally up to you. Like, where you guys choose to live, it's a values decision, whatever." But I would mention a couple things. One is, my wife feels safer in Dubai than anywhere else in the world as a woman. And so that's a thing. And I would just encourage you to come and visit. Like, go and spend 2 weeks. And I frequently have people who will come to Dubai, never having been before. And they're like, wow, it's not what I was expecting. Like, hey, it's just like being in Las Vegas, but cleaner and with less violence. And, like, it's very interesting, people's perception. That's one of the reasons why I think it's important for people to travel, right? Is whether you're going to go and live there, like, it's a pretty big thing to have somebody go and move from Denmark to Qatar, but to get them to go and spend a week in Qatar, that's not such a big thing. It's like, all right, there's some nice resorts in some of these places. There's cool tourist attractions. You're going to go somewhere to check things out anyway. Why not go and check out a part of the world that's a little bit different? Why not go to China? Why not go to somewhere in Southeast Asia? Why, all these different places. And you kind of discover that actually some of these places are pretty great.